Hello, welcome to Waypoint Survival. Today, I want to talk to you about the top 10 reasons why we admire the classic hobos and their culture. Stay tuned. The first reason why we admire the classic hobo culture is that they were experts at stealth camping. Stealth camping has become really popular these days. And they had to deal with all sort of train guards, often known as bulls. And they were mistreated and mishandled by a lot of people, could even face jail time. Of course, the railroads did not like people walking on their property or riding on their cars for free. So they became experts, not only in the hobo jungles, but also at setting up their campsites. They became very, very good at hiding and building campsites that were very efficient. Reason number two is that the hobos learned how to survive with very little. Most of them were very poor, which is why they took to the rails in the first place. They didn't have money to pay for the fare that it cost to ride in the passenger train cars. So they would hop on a freight car. Sometimes they would ride underneath the cars, called riding the rails. It was a very dangerous thing. A lot of them got hurt. Of course, being a hobo was dangerous. It's one of the reasons why the railroads were so against it. A lot of hobos lost limbs, and many of them lost their lives pursuing freight trains or falling under the wheels. So it's a very dangerous thing. The next reason we like to copy or emulate the classic hobo is they were experts at repurposing items that would normally just cast off or thrown away, such as tin cans. Often their camps would consist of old things that nobody wanted. They were expert scavengers at dump sites and various places where people would throw out things that maybe had broken handles or bits and pieces of china or glassware, and might have bits or chunks missing out of it, but they would still repurpose it and use it. And they found that they could put together a pretty good little camp or hobo jungle, which they would of course share with their friends. They also learned how to pack really efficiently. They had to cover their basic needs, of course, as they are traveling on the road. They couldn't carry a lot of weight because they had to not only carry it on their back sometimes for many miles, but they also had to be able to run with it, to sling it up into a boxcar, and then climb on after it. So they were really good expert packers, and they learned how to make do with what they had, so that when they packed their kit, they had to keep it lightweight and small, and also something that could be hidden in case the railroad bulls might come after them, or they would have to wait at a place until the next train would come by. They also, unfortunately, because of human nature, had to deal with other people who were not quite as scrupulous, and of course they would be robbed and people would take what they had. So maybe after a few years on the road, you learned to minimize what you had so that you could make sure and carry it with you and protect it while you were sleeping or when you were away at town working. Next, the hobos also dressed very efficiently for rough travel, as well as for camping in all sorts of weather. Remember, they were often considered outcasts of society when they would go from town to town, and sometimes towns would band together and run them off. Even though many of them were just hard-working and honest people, like most transients today, they got a really bad reputation, even though most of them tried very, very hard to keep up the hobo code and to be kind to others and treat others with dignity and respect. Yet because they didn't really have a home in the community and because they were strangers, they were viewed with suspicion. So the clothes that they wore had to be very serviceable. They had to make sure that they were able to spend the night outdoors if they had to, and often that was the case because they just couldn't find a good place to sleep. And when they did find a place to sleep, it was often in barns or maybe under a back porch somewhere, and of course in those kind of conditions, not the most comfortable. Another reason that we might wish to copy or emulate the classic hobo is that they were willing to pass on and teach their skills to others. There's stories about hobos who would take some young person under their wing, someone who maybe in a large family and there wasn't enough work to sustain them on the farm, got into difficult times, and so the young person would hit the rails, strike out and catch out on a load of boxcars to try to seek their fortune, but also to find work so they could support themselves. People got really hungry back in those days, just as people do today, but they didn't have all the welfare and social systems, the safety nets that we have developed today. So it was very important that the older hobos and that culture, they took the youngsters under their wing and showed them how to live. And of course, remember that they were very cautious about young people, and they would report any sort of abuse to the authorities because that simply couldn't be tolerated by the hobo culture. The next reason that we would want to copy or emulate the classic hobo is that they understand the need for community. They were very communal, and they learned how to share with one another. They saw someone in need and they could help supply that need, whether it was a meager pot of stew of some sort, mulligan stew or whatever they were happened to be making at the moment, or stone soup, which was a popular way to make soup back in those days. They shared with each other. And so they had a real sense of community and of caring for one another. And of course, that's always a good character trait. Another reason why we admire the hobos of the classic era was that they held themselves to a code of conduct. But they not only held themselves to a code of conduct, but they would also hold others. And as much as they were a brotherhood and a sisterhood, there were, at one point, they estimated at least 10,000 women that traveled as hobos as well. But as much as they held themselves to that code of conduct, and as much as they wanted that brotherhood and that sense of family along the rails, yet if someone was found to be a criminal and doing things that was not appropriate, again, especially with children, they could find themselves handed over to the authorities. Another reason why we admire the classic hobos of that era is that they were used to dealing with hardships. They were a tough and stoic breed of people. They had, many of them, grown up in areas that were lacking. Remember, a lot of these folks grew up without electricity, without indoor plumbing to begin with. So being out on the open road, they already had a fair amount of experience in dealing with tough times. And remember, we are looking around the era of the 1930s, of course during the Great Depression, and during that time period, people were just grateful for whatever they could get. And so sleeping out on the hard ground, we often today think we've got to have a cot or some sort of a ground mat, but often if they just had a blanket to roll up in, they were a hardy and tough people, and they could do that. They could sleep out on the ground for days on end. I'm sure it wasn't comfortable, but they learned how to make do, and often if you could just be warm and have a nice fire and something in your stomach, it was enough to be grateful for another day. And last, the classic hobo culture, they understood the value of hard work. They weren't like a lot of folks today who are used to handouts and things that are given to them freely by the government. They knew they had to work hard for what they had. And interestingly enough, a lot of America was built by the hobos. All the way from bridges to dams. I've heard that Hoover Dam was actually built by a lot of hobos. The national parks, a lot of the CCC projects, the Civilian Conservation Corps, a lot of those trails that we hike today were put in by hobos. They would of course engage in local building projects wherever they could find work, and so a lot of your buildings in the local towns were built by these traveling men and women in the hobo culture. Of course, a lot of local farms found them to be very useful, and they used them as ranch or farm hands, as day laborers, as well as seasonal workers who would help to bring in the harvest when the time was come. And then often the hobos would head for warmer climates. They would go to states like California or Florida, Texas, places where it wasn't so hard to survive through the harsh winter months. This is James Bender for Waypoint Survival. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Also make sure and check out the links in the description box below, just under the More button. And while you're down there, you'll also find our waypointsurvival.com link. And this is where you can sign up to take survival and bushcraft classes at our beautiful training facility in Southern Ohio. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the channel. We'd really appreciate it. And when you do subscribe, make sure and press that bell button so that you can stay notified of all of our upcoming videos, and we'll talk to you next time.